The Premier League is the most watched league in all of world sport, let alone in all of world football. Often marketed as being the most entertaining league in the world by Sky Sports and others, and occasionally the even more grandiose best league in the world, there is another aspect in which the Premier League stands tall and reigns supreme over every other league in world football. And that is when it comes to truly terrible signings. Yes, English football's top flight is both very rich and, quite often, very stupid. And that dastardly combination has led to some absolutely mind-bogglingly bad pieces of transfer business. That's right, from Bosco Balaban to Dani Osvaldo, the Premier League is in a league of its own when it comes to buggering it up. So I thought that it would make for an interesting video to take a look and, indeed, have a laugh at some of the very worst signings in the league's 30-year history. Without further ado then, here is the worst Premier League signing, in my opinion, every single season from the 1992-93 season up to the current 2021-22 campaign. 1992-93, Torben Piechnik. It is always a grave danger signing players off the back of international tournaments, as may become a bit of a theme at times in this video, and the tournament which took place immediately before the creation of the Premier League was of course Euro 92. Denmark, having not even initially qualified for that tournament, won it in extraordinary fashion, and centre-back Torben Piechnik clearly caught the eye of Graham Souness and his Liverpool staff. Piechnik looked like a dogged and determined last-ditch defender at the Euros, putting it all on the line and denying some of Europe's best forwards. However, following his £500,000 move to the Premier League, Piechnik was run ragged at Anfield. Having flourished in a backline that liked to sit deep and absorb pressure, he looked hopeless in a Liverpool team that looked to press higher up the pitch and squeeze their opponents. Piechnik reportedly refused to adapt his game, insisting that it was Souness who should change how he played and not him. He lasted just over a year on Merseyside, getting substituted at half-time against Newcastle in his final game for the club, before being sent back to Denmark. Following retirement, Piechnik has worked as both a masseuse and as a real estate agent. An honourable mention goes to the world's lankiest man, Ian Ormondroyd, and his 1992 move to Leicester City. 1993-94, Julian Dicks. I would hate to be seen to be picking on Liverpool in these early stages, but it must be said that Graham Souness has an almost uniquely terrible record when it comes to making utterly dog-dirt signings in the history of the Premier League. Julian Dicks is a West Ham United legend, having cultivated a hardman image due to his tough tackling and fierce left-footed shots across more than 300 appearances for the Hammers. In between his two stints at West Ham, however, Dicks was signed by Liverpool for a whopping £1.5 million on the advice of Harry Redknapp, as Souness sought to toughen up his team, pairing Dicks with fellow hardman Neil Ruddock. Sadly for Dicks, Souness resigned during his debut campaign, and he and his successor Roy Evans did not see eye to eye. Dicks was banished to go and train with the youth team, being frozen out by Evans and accused of being overweight and unfit. He promptly returned to West Ham, following only 28 games at Anfield, where he would trim back down to size and would win another 2 Hammer of the Year awards. 1994-95, Brett Angell. When you take a flyer in football on a player who is thriving in a lower league, inevitably, sometimes it will work out, and sometimes it won't. Jamie Vardy is a great advert of just how well it can work out, and Brett Angell is a pretty decent warning of how badly it can go wrong. A towering centre-forward who first made his name at Stockport County, Angell was prolific at Southend United in the old 4th and 3rd divisions, before reaching the 2nd division. There, he suffered a pretty serious injury to his left leg, which required surgery, but Everton still took him on loan twice before paying £500,000 for him. Often cited as having been Everton's worst player of all time, Angell scored just 1 goal in 21 appearances for the Toffees. Teammate Neville Southall said that the step up to the Premier League had been too big for him, which I think was his idea of being diplomatic, and described his first touch as being like a tackle, which was maybe a bit more harsh. Angell subsequently struggled again at Sunderland before rediscovering his shooting boots in the lower leagues, firstly with Stockport and later with Walsall. 1995-96, Tomas Brolin. One of the Premier League's all-time great terrible signings, Tomas Brolin was one of the best midfielders in Europe during the early to mid-1990s, winning UEFA Cups with Parma and reaching the semi-finals of World Cups with Sweden. In 1994, he even finished fourth in Ballon d'Or voting, ahead of Eric Cantona and Franco Baresi. Leeds United fans thought that they'd got a bit of a coup when they signed Brolin then, in November 1995, for £4.5 million. Just 2 months into life at Ellen Road, Brolin was being publicly lambasted by manager Howard Wilkinson for not pulling his weight. Brolin's weight would later become an even bigger issue in West Yorkshire as he piled on the pounds following a series of injury setbacks. Brolin claimed that the biggest issue he faced at Leeds was being played out of position. But whoever was to blame, he made just 20 appearances for the club, he left for nothing, and he hardly ever played again, retiring aged 28. Dishonourable mentions go to Dutch centre-forward Marco Boogers at West Ham United and Italian target man Andrea Silenzi at Nottingham Forest. 1996-97, Nikola Jerkan. A Nottingham Forest horror show just missed out to Tomas Brolin last time out, but where Andrea Silenzi failed, Nikola Jerkan succeeds. In reality, both men failed in exactly the same place, and that was at the City Ground. Signed in the summer of 1996 after starring for Croatia at the European Championships in England, Jerkan was already 31 years old, but he still set Forest back £1 million. A defensive disaster class, Jerkan made 14 appearances at the City Ground as Forest were relegated with by far the worst goal difference in the entire division. He subsequently signed for Rapid Vienna on loan before departing on a free to Belgian club Charleroi, where he played just one season of football before retiring. 1997-98, Stan Collymore. An outstanding Premier League centre-forward at his best, it would be fair to say that Stan Collymore peaked fairly early on during his career. He struck 22 times in 37 games in his first full Premier League season at Nottingham Forest, prompting a club record move to Liverpool. Collymore averaged almost a goal every other game at Anfield before moving for another club record fee, this time to his own boyhood club Aston Villa, in a deal worth £7 million. Sadly for both Villa and Collymore, he could not replicate either his Liverpool or Forest form in the West Midlands, only scoring a meagre 7 league goals in 3 seasons contracted to the club. When Collymore finally departed in the year 2000, he left on a free, cementing his status as a truly wretched signing on Villa's part. 1998-99, Kevin Davies. Kevin Davies is synonymous, in my mind at least, with Bolton Wanderers, where he spent a decade and played more than 400 games, and particularly with the Sam Allardyce era at Bolton, where he didn't score all that many goals but was a constant menace to play against. Davies' most prolific campaign, in all competitions, actually came during the 1997-98 season at Southampton, where he scored 12 goals in 30 games, prompting one of the worst transfers of the Premier League era. Free-spending Blackburn Rovers paid Southampton £7.5 million for Davies, 10 times what Southampton had paid for him just 12 months earlier, in addition to sending James Beattie in the opposite direction. Davies scored once in 21 Premier League appearances at Ewood Park before being sent back to Southampton, initially on loan, and eventually rejoining the Saints on a free transfer, after Blackburn released him. As if that wasn't bad enough, James Beattie became a Southampton legend, scoring 76 goals in 235 games across the course of 7 seasons at St Mary's, before himself being sold for £6 million to Everton. What an absolute car crash from a Blackburn perspective. 1999-2000, Massimo Taibi. A dishonourable mention for the 1999-2000 season must go to Honduran international Milton Nunes, who joined Sunderland that season for £1.6 million, plus a potential £1 million in future add-ons, despite the fact that he had just failed to score in 10 games for Pauka in Greece. It has been quite heavily, and I would say quite credibly reported, that Sunderland genuinely signed Nunes by accident in a case of mistaken identity, and he only ever played one game for the club. Remarkably, Nunes only retired in the year 2020, whilst playing back in Honduras, at the grand old age of 48. That is pretty diabolical, but Massimo Taibi still trumps him by virtue of his £4.5 million price tag. You have to sympathise with anyone who is tasked with replacing Peter Schmeichel at a club like Manchester United, but Taibi did have a particularly difficult time. Dubbed the Blind Venetian at Old Trafford, Taibi only made 4 Premier League appearances under Alex Ferguson before promptly being shown the exit. 2000 to 2001, Winston Bogarde. There was no lack of terrible Premier League signings in the 2000 to 2001 season, whether that be Agustin Delgado to Southampton, Sergei Rebrov to Spurs, or Aid Akinbayi to Leicester City. Seeing off all of that competition though, and with some comfort, is Winston Bogarde. It takes a special kind of dreadful signing to make a video such as this, despite being signed on a free, but despite that caveat, Bogarde is one of the Premier League's worst signings of all time. Bogarde was reportedly astonished that Chelsea offered him a 4-year deal worth £40,000 a week, despite the fact they had barely played for Barcelona the previous season. Shortly after he arrived, manager Gianluca Vialli was sacked, Claudio Ranieri came in, and he wanted Bogarde out. The Dutchman flat out refused to leave, claiming that no one would offer him the kind of money that he was on at Chelsea. So he just sat around for 4 years, collecting his paychecks without playing any football. Bogarde famously commented that he didn't care about being one of the worst Premier League signings of all time, because Chelsea made him a very rich man. He retired in 2005, a year after leaving Chelsea, having failed to find a new club. 2001-02, Steve Marlet. The 2001-02 season was like a mecca for terrible transfers, so it says a lot about just how bad Steve Marlet's signing was that he comes out on top of the lot. Bosco Balaban, Francis Jeffers, Seth Johnson, Juan Sebastian Veron, and Corrado Grabbi all earned dishonourable mentions. But Steve Marlet cost Fulham £11.5 million when he arrived from Lyon in 2001 as a full French international. He scored only 11 goals in 4 years contracted to the Cottagers, and he left for nothing. It later emerged that Jean Tigana, the Fulham manager who signed Marlet and had very close ties to Lyon, actually briefly served as the player's own agent, leading to Fulham owner Mohamed El Fayed taking Tigana to the Court of Arbitration for Sport and accusing him of paying an exorbitant transfer fee for Marlet and taking a cut himself. Al Fayed's charges were pretty swiftly dropped, and Fulham wouldn't pay a bigger transfer fee until 2008. 2002-03, El Hadji Diouf. We are back at Anfield in 2002, and just as they did a decade earlier, in 1992, Liverpool fell into the trap of signing a player off the back of their performances at an international tournament. Liverpool paid a reported £10 million to sign Diouf from Lens after he starred in Senegal's run to the quarter-finals of the World Cup, but he was rather less impressive in England. Diouf only managed 3 Premier League goals in his debut campaign, and he failed to score a single goal in all competitions, despite playing 33 times during his second season at Anfield. Best known in England for his controversial comments, his tendency to spit at people, and his rows with Steven Gerrard, Jamie Carragher said of Diouf that, quote, "He has one of the worst strike rates of any forward in Liverpool history. He is the only number 9 ever to go through a whole season without scoring. In fact, he is probably the only number 9 of any club to do that. He was always the last one to get picked in training." End quote. He sees off the competition of fellow 2002 Liverpool arrival Bruno Chiru, who was rather unfortunately nicknamed the new Zidane by manager Gerard Houllier. Spoiler alert, he wasn't. 2003-04, Adrian Mutu. Roman Abramovich rolled into the Premier League in 2003, spending so much money that both brilliant and dreadful signings alike were an inevitability. Adrian Mutu was arguably his worst, not just of the summer of 2003, ahead of Juan Sebastian Veron, who earns his second dishonourable mention, but perhaps the worst, of his entire reign as Chelsea owner to date. Mutu joined Chelsea from Parma for a pretty hefty £15.8 million, but he actually got off to a decent start at Stamford Bridge. Problems arose initially after Jose Mourinho joined Chelsea and he and Mutu clashed, but they got really bad when the Romanian failed a drugs test. Chelsea attempted to sue Mutu for breach of contract, aiming to recoup not only the entire value of his contract, but also that of his transfer fee. Chelsea were successful in court, but Mutu's appeals ended up spanning 13 years, and although he was ultimately unsuccessful, the fact that he doesn't have the means to pay Chelsea what the courts awarded them made the whole process rather pointless, and probably ended up costing Chelsea even more than they paid for him in admin and legal fees. 2004-05, Jiri Jarosik. It is a Chelsea double from Roman's first two seasons, as Jiri Jarosik earns an inclusion ahead of Matija Kezman for the 2004-05 season. Kezman doesn't feature, despite being a dreadful signing, because Chelsea recouped basically the entirety of what they paid PSV to sign him when they sold him to Atletico Madrid after just 12 months at Stamford Bridge. The Blues would not be as fortunate with Jiri Jarosik, who they signed for a reported £3 million from CSKA Moscow in January 2005. The Czech international made 14 fairly mediocre appearances during his half-season at Stamford Bridge as a utility player, but Chelsea signed Lassana Diarra and Michael Essien the following summer, rendering him surplus to requirements. Jarosik joined Birmingham City on loan, followed by Celtic on a permanent basis, who paid less than a third of what Chelsea had paid for him, and he still managed to be a dreadful signing for them as well. 2005-06, Michael Owen. Michael Owen is not a particularly popular man in Newcastle upon Tyne, and that sentence would still ring true if I hadn't added the clause, in Newcastle upon Tyne. Owen is a strange human being, and that comes across almost every time that he opens his mouth or even just posts something on social media. But he was a fabulous centre-forward. As a teenager at Liverpool, he was terrifyingly good. In 2005 then, Newcastle fans were thrilled when they brought the England star back to the Premier League in a club record £16.8 million move from Real Madrid. For a club that had just finished 14th in the Premier League, the prospect of a Shearer and Owen strike partnership was a fairly remarkable one. Sadly, they wouldn't get to see that strike partnership very often. Owen was blighted by injuries at St James's Park and only played 14 games in his first two seasons at the club. When he was fit, in his third and fourth seasons, he did still score goals. But on the final day of the 2008-09 season, with Newcastle threatened with relegation, it is reported that Owen refused to play against Fulham because he was worried about getting injured and failing to find a new club on a free over the summer. Newcastle lost the game and were relegated. In total, Owen cost Newcastle around £40 million when you combine his transfer fee and wages before joining Manchester United for nothing. So he takes this one ahead of nightmare £5 million Everton signing Per Kroldrup. 2006-07, Andriy Shevchenko. Two of the greatest forwards of my lifetime feature side by side in this list, as Andriy Shevchenko joins Michael Owen, proving that even the very best of players can still be terrible signings given the wrong set of circumstances. The circumstances for Andriy Shevchenko were that Roman Abramovich had wanted to sign him for more than a year, Jose Mourinho didn't, and it was Uncle Roman who got his way, with Shevchenko arriving at Stamford Bridge for a British record transfer fee of £30.8 million, despite the fact that he was soon to turn 30. Now, Mourinho never wanted Shevchenko, so he primarily played him out wide in his 4-3-3 system, understandably, in some respects, given the form of Didier Drogba through the middle. Injury problems didn't help the Ukrainian, who was recently sacked by Genoa, and he only went on to score 9 goals for Chelsea in the Premier League across 48 games. Factor in the fact that he left for nothing and was most likely one of the league's top earners throughout his 3 years contracted to the Blues, this was a pretty safe inclusion. 2007-08, Kieron Dyer. 2007-08 was another blockbuster season for absolutely dreadful signings, And you know something has gone pretty badly wrong when you see off competition from the likes of Mido, Rolando Bianchi and Owen Hargreaves to seal a spot in a list of this ilk. It must be said, Hargreaves was only such a terrible signing because of injuries, but they did still make him a terrible signing regardless. Kieron Dyer is another England international midfielder who was blighted by injuries, primarily following his £6 million transfer to West Ham in the summer of 2007. A sensation at Newcastle for 8 seasons, Dyer broke his leg in 2 places just 10 days after making his debut for West Ham. Following much speculation that he would be forced to retire, Dyer returned to action after 17 months, but persistent hamstring injuries followed. In January 2010, when David Sullivan and David Gold, aka the Dildo Brothers, acquired West Ham, they revealed the extent of the Hammers' debts, which totalled more than £100 million. Sullivan wanted Dyer to retire like Dean Ashton had, pointing out that he had only played 18 games in the last 3 years. Dyer refused, seeing out the rest of his 4-year deal at Upton Park, and it was later revealed by the Daily Telegraph that Dyer was West Ham's highest earner, on £83,000 a week throughout that time. In total, Dyer cost West Ham roughly £450,000 per appearance that he made for the club, which is roughly the same as PSG pay Lionel Messi per game now. 2008-09, Savio Nsereko. When the Dildo Brothers reviewed West Ham's accounts in January 2010, one thing that must have stuck out even more than Kieron Dyer's wages must surely have been Savio Nsereko's transfer fee. The Ugandan-born German youth team international set West Ham back £9 million in January 2009, which was equivalent to about £40 million back then. A club record signing who was brought in as a replacement for Craig Bellamy. Quite what evidence West Ham had to go on that he was worth that amount of money remains unknown to this day. Nsereko only ever played 10 Premier League matches for West Ham, failing to score a single goal, and he was sold after 6 months for less than £2 million. An extraordinarily bad piece of business, Nsereko beats Afonso Alves' transfer to Middlesbrough, David Bentley's move to Tottenham, Joe joining Manchester City, and Hull City's club record signing of Jimmy Bullard as the worst Premier League signing of the 2008-09 campaign. 2009-10, Alberto Aquilani. When Liverpool splashed out £17 million on Alberto Aquilani in the summer of 2009, the Italian was widely billed as being a replacement for the departing Xabi Alonso. Those are big boots to fill, and, as Aquilani has since pointed out, he was never really cut from the same cloth as Alonso. A more attack-minded playmaker, or even box-to-box midfielder, Aquilani barely played for Liverpool, despite having arrived for what was then a very large fee. Aquilani made 6 assists for Liverpool in the Premier League, which, when one thinks that he only ever made 18 appearances in the league, many of them coming off the bench, is actually a pretty impressive record. Nonetheless, he wasn't what Liverpool wanted, and he could never nail down a starting berth, departing twice on loan and then on a permanent to Fiorentina in 2012, in what resulted in a great financial loss to the Reds. 2010-11, Andy Carroll. Pipping YouTube sensation Bebe to a spot in this list, Liverpool paid £35 million for Andy Carroll. £35 million. £35 million. Good God. You will have to locate your nearest Balenciaga store to find a worse deal than that. Carroll scored 6 goals in 44 Premier League games for Liverpool before departing for £17 million, as the Reds spunked away most of Fernando Torres' £50 million transfer fee. 2011-12, Roger Johnson. Seeing off stiff competition from £5.85 million South Korean Park Chu-young, who flopped majorly at Arsenal after the Gunners went to great lengths to hijack his move to Monaco, Roger Johnson was not only a terrible signing in of himself for Wolverhampton Wanderers, he ended up having a pretty damning impact on the entire club. Signed for a fee of somewhere between £4 to £7 million from Birmingham City in the summer of 2011, Johnson was immediately installed as Wolves' new captain by manager Mick McCarthy, replacing Carl Henry. That perhaps didn't go down great with the rest of the Wolves squad, and when McCarthy was sacked midway through the season and replaced by his assistant Terry Connor, Johnson only featured in 2 more games. He was later disciplined by the club for turning up to training unfit to train, reportedly, due to alcohol consumption, as Wolves were relegated. The following season, Wolves were relegated again, this time to League One, making it 3 relegations on the bounce for Johnson. Despite repeated efforts by Wolves to get rid of him, Johnson flat out refused, since no one would offer him the same wage package, before he eventually departed via mutual contract termination. 2012-13, Jose Bosingwa. I could easily have gone with former Southampton club record signing Gaston Ramirez for the 2012-13 season, who was deeply underwhelming at St Mary's. But Jose Bosingwa was like a metaphor for all that was terrible about Queen's Park Rangers in the 2012-13 season. With considerable financial backing, the West Londoners signed a series of players on enormous wages, Bosingwa foremost among them. Unfortunately, many of these players didn't care one jot about QPR and were just looking for one last big payday. Bosingwa was a 2-time Champions League winner at Porto and Chelsea, but he was hopeless at Loftus Road and was even spotted laughing coming off the pitch after the club's relegation had been confirmed. That really rubbed salt in the wounds for Queen's Park Rangers fans, so despite arriving on a free, he takes this one. 2013-14, Roberto Soldado. Roberto Soldado arrived at Tottenham Hotspur surrounded by a great deal of excitement. He had scored 81 goals in 141 games for Valencia, including 30 in 46 the previous campaign, hence why he set Spurs back a club record £26 million. I remember him looking pretty underwhelming, but scoring a penalty on his debut against Crystal Palace when, in truth, that was about as good as it would get for the Spaniard at White Hart Lane. He scored just 7 goals in 52 Premier League games in North London and left the club in a deal worth just £10 million after 2 seasons to join Villarreal. A real disaster then, and just about bad enough to prevent Kostas Mitroglou from featuring, who was abysmal at Fulham, along with Dani Osvaldo, who looked alright for about 3 weeks at Southampton, before getting into a fight with Jose Font, going on loan to Juventus, and then deciding that he just didn't want to play football anymore. 2014-15, Jack Rodwell. Liverpool signed a deeply disruptive human statue in the form of Mario Balotelli to replace Luis Suarez, and Manchester City inexplicably spent £42 million on Eliaquim Mangala in the 2014-15 season, which is about £40 million more than he was worth. But both are blown out of the water by Jack Rodwell's transfer to Sunderland. For £10 million, it seemed as though Sunderland were picking up an England international who had looked extremely promising at Everton before struggling for game time following a big move to Manchester City, and there's certainly no shame in that. In reality, they were signing a vastly overpaid midfielder who seemed to do nothing except bring Sunderland extraordinarily bad luck. Rodwell went 3 years, 8 months, and 29 days without winning a game of football, and the worst was still to come. Reportedly paid £70,000 a week at the Stadium of Light, Sunderland desperately sought to offload Rodwell as they tumbled down the divisions, but with very little success. Pound for pound, Rodwell is without a doubt one of the most damaging signings in the history of not just the Premier League, but in all of world football. 2015-16, Ricky Alvarez. It is a double up for Sunderland, I am sorry to say, and this time they faced even stiffer competition. Aston Villa signed Joleon Lescott and Mika Richards in the 2015-16 season, both of whom were blighted by injuries as Villa finished bottom of the division, whilst hoovering up enormous salaries. Elsewhere, Stoke City broke their transfer record to sign Gianni Mbula, the less said about that one the better, and Everton forked out £13.5 million on professional football impersonator Oumar Niasse. Ricky Alvarez was somehow worse than all 4 of them, having joined Sunderland on loan the previous season and not having impressed. Unfortunately for the Black Cats, a clause in his loan deal dictated that, should they stay up, they would be obligated to sign him for €10.5 million. Perhaps Sunderland didn't think that they had any chance of staying up, but following yet another great escape, and despite their best efforts, they were unable to find a way to pull out of signing the Argentine. Alvarez never played for Sunderland following his €10.5 million move, and following a series of legal battles, he ended up costing the club more than £20 million. I really wasn't lying in the introduction when I said that the Premier League reigns supreme when it comes to terrible signings. 2016-17, Saido Berahino. Sunderland are very fortunate not to make it a hat-trick of inclusions with Papa Gilabocci, who they paid £8 million to sign from Chelsea, only for him to defend like Ronald McDonald refused to train following relegation before basically getting sacked for breach of contract. Saido Berahino can do even better than that though, having set Stoke City back an initial £12 million and a potential £15 million, having long been linked with a move to Tottenham Hotspur. Spurs will be glad that they dodged that particular bullet, as Berahino went 913 days, so pretty much 2.5 years, without scoring a single goal. He went on to score just 5 goals in 56 games for Stoke, none of which came in the Premier League, before departing for nothing. I would throw in an honourable mention for Paul Pogba, but I can't be bothered to deal with all the hassle. Well, I suppose I've done it now. He arrived for a world record fee. I don't think that it has gone very well. There, I said it. 2017-18, Alexis Sanchez. I have resisted the temptation to include Danny Drinkwater in this list, quite commendably, I think you would have to admit, partly because he seems to get a very hard time from me on this channel, and I wouldn't wish to be seen to be picking on anyone. It must be said, paying £35 million for Danny Drinkwater is possibly the strangest thing to happen in football since Wayne Hennessy claimed that this is how he gets a waiter's attention in a restaurant when he was accused of performing a Nazi salute. Meanwhile, his manager Roy Hodgson commented that Hennessy was previously unaware of World War II, but was now very interested to learn more about it. With that being said, I do think that there is a solid case to be made for Alexis Sanchez having been an even worse signing than Drinkwater. Whilst a far superior player, of course, he went from being arguably the league's star man at Arsenal to looking utterly mediocre, if not worse, at Manchester United. Not only that, the Red Devils paid through the nose to prevent him joining Pep Guardiola at Man City, making the Chilean the Premier League's highest earner, and by some distance. All round, it was just a horrible deal, indicative of Manchester United's short-sightedness over the last 8 or 9 years. So Sanchez features ahead of Drinkwater's move to Chelsea and also Gylfi Sigurdsson's ridiculous transfer to Everton. 2018-19, Ben Gibson. I am showing great restraint yet again in letting Chelsea off the hook, this time with regard to the £72 million acquisition of Kepa Arrizabalaga. Look, I know that Kepa has done a decent job when called upon over the last 18 months, and I always said that there was a decent keeper in there. But to pay £72 million sterling, a world record-breaking fee for a goalkeeper no less, for someone who is now a number 2 is a dreadful piece of business, whichever way you spin it. Chelsea are let off thanks to an unlikely source, in the form of Burnley, who rarely throw money at players. The Clarets cast aside the habit of a lifetime to sign Ben Gibson for a joint club record £15 million from Middlesbrough, at a time when the centre-back was being tipped for an England call-up. Gibson's time at Turf Moor was pretty bizarre, but clearly something went badly wrong behind the scenes. In 3 years contracted to the club, Gibson played just 1 Premier League game and played only 6 games in all competitions. He finally departed in the summer of 2021, with Norwich City's obligation to purchase him for £8 million whilst he was on loan at Carroll Road, having been triggered by the Canaries winning promotion to the Premier League. 2019-20, Nicolas Pepe. There is no lack of extremely expensive competition from the 2019-20 season, including Tanguy Ndombele, Joelinton, and Harry Maguire. I think Ndombele is extremely gifted, but he was all too often absent at Tottenham and just never clicked at the club. Joelinton has looked much improved playing in central midfield under Eddie Howe, though £40 million is still pretty outrageous. And Harry Maguire, whilst obviously overpriced at £80 million, as would almost every defender in world football, he is a good Premier League centre-back in the right system, as he has shown at times for both Manchester United and England. And I know that that isn't a popular opinion, but I still maintain that it is true. Nicolas Pepe, on the other hand, who lit up Ligue 1 with Lille, would appear to have very few redeeming qualities for Arsenal, as far as I can tell. Quick, inventive, and in possession of a brilliant left-footed shot, the Ivorian is also ridiculously inconsistent, extremely lightweight, and basically useless at doing anything other than the things that I just mentioned him being very good at. He has scored 15 goals in 69 Premier League games for Arsenal, despite costing more than twice as much as Mohamed Salah, which made him the most expensive African footballer in the history of the sport. 2020-21, Donny van de Beek. Very honourable or dishonourable mentions must go to Giovanni Lo Celso's transfer to Tottenham and Leeds United's club record signing of Rodrigo in the 2020-21 season, both of which just haven't worked out, but for very different reasons. However, I think the right answer for the 2020-21 season is Donny van de Beek. Brilliant at Ajax, Manchester United supposedly saw of plenty of competition to sign the Dutchman in the summer of 2020 for £35 million, with the potential to rise to £40 million subject to add-ons. You might have thought, therefore, that they would have some plans in terms of where and how to play him. You would have been wrong. Van de Beek's primary role at Old Trafford has been keeping the bench warm before being sent on loan to Everton. His age means that Manchester United could recoup a decent portion of his transfer fee should he impress at Goodison Park, but as things stand, he has been a fairly rotten addition. 2021-22, Emerson Royal. Into the current season, and this was the most difficult of all, since it is still too early to judge all of these signings. The three most expensive summer 2021 Premier League arrivals, namely Jack Grealish, Romelu Lukaku, and Jadon Sancho, have all been pretty underwhelming thus far. Meanwhile, the most high-profile signing, Cristiano Ronaldo to Manchester United, has been rather a dubious one, with Ronaldo having scored no lack of goals, but Manchester United actually having got worse as a team, and Ronaldo seemingly not being able to exert any kind of positive influence upon their fortunes. I've overlooked all four of them though, because every time I've seen him this season, Emerson Royal has looked royally hopeless. This could well age badly since it is so early days, and, I hope that it does since it's never nice to see a player struggle, unless it's Carl Henry, and I don't have anything against Spurs. At this stage, though, it looks as though Tottenham have paid £25.8 million for a right-back or right-wing-back who cannot defend or attack, has zero positional awareness, is useless on the ball, and rash in the tackle. I saw Emerson have some decent games at Real Betis, so I'm not sure what has happened to him. But given Antonio Conte's reliance on wing-backs, it wouldn't surprise me if he was already eyeing up potential replacements. All things considered, he takes this one for the time being. So that is it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. I hope that you enjoyed it. Feel free to hit the like button if that was the case. Apparently it helps with the algorithm. It is totally free of charge, and it's just a really nice thing to do. Feel free to leave any comments if you have anything to say, whether it is of interest or not, or simply abuse. And obviously make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on for HITC Sevens. You can also find me on social media, on either Twitter or Instagram, or indeed both, via the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.